So we have this slide, and we have another slide of neighbor myths. We can jump back and forth and do whatever we want. We can also, if you have any city, local government myths you want to talk about still, let's do that. And again, I'll invite you that if you can think of any myths that you feel like that people don't quite understand, be sure to bring them up. But I put this up during the break so you can look at it and think about what you wanted to talk about, and now's the time.
Somebody pick one. Wow, the break must have made everybody tired or whatever. Somebody pick one. All right.
Does a rezone set a precedent?
All right, does a rezone set a precedent? Brent, property rights ombudsman, former.
When I was the ombudsman, I used to hear that a lot from property owners and developers. The old, they did it for that guy, they need to do it for me. Anybody want to take a crack on, if you were the ombudsman, how you would answer that question?
Of course.
Of course. Only the smartest person in the room just said, of course. Somebody said something. Melinda. What does the code say? So the key thing about this is to understand that what the code says today may not be what the code says when we said yes to that guy. Right? That's important. But the question here particularly is about rezones and whether or not rezones set a precedent. Todd just wants me to answer the question.
Nope. Nope. And if I think about it really hard, no. Nope, they don't.
It does not. Because a rezone comes with legislative discretion. And remember those words if they're not familiar to you, but legislative discretion means that when you can take two pieces of property that are right next to each other, that look identical, and you can zone them differently, as long as you have a rational basis to do that. So, and that rational basis standard is so low. It's almost nothing. So, no, the answer is a rezone does not set a precedent. Lynn.
Yeah, Lynn.
Yes, I think that is widely known because I agree with that.
Hang on, Lynn. Let's get you a microphone so that the online folks can hear what you have to say. You always have such good words of wisdom, Lynn. He's over there.
Thank you both. I think you gave us the textbook answer, which of course is what we appreciate most. But where this gets gray is if the down zoning is from X to open space, or something that denies all economic use of the property. And even that one is easy, right? If you deny all use, it's pretty easy. Then a down zoning can become a taking. What we often run into, and others may find the same thing, is developer has X, the city council down zones it to something else, and he claims he can't make money at that project, when the reality is maybe he just can't make as much money. But that's where the gray area comes in, and that's where the legal fights may result.
And I would totally agree with that, and we advise our clients that way all the time, and we always tell them no court in this state has ever overturned a rezone decision of a city. At some point, a court's going to. We don't want it to be you, so, prepare your findings and do it right. Those horrible takings cases, even then, are dependent on the individual facts of each case. So if a developer is telling your staff or his counsel is telling you, you set a precedent when you rezoned X piece of property, no, not necessarily true. Now, should we be thinking in ways that are consistent, and should we try to make decisions that are consistent? Should we have a real plan for what we're doing in a city? Yes, absolutely. But legally, do they set a precedent? No.
And I go back again to that example we used right at the beginning of the session, where it was alleged that the council was making the decision based on personal reasons for a development that was right next to another development that obviously was approved, and now they weren't approving this one. To me, it kind of goes, it overlaps with the other box that we have there on the left side that says, must the city do the smart or moral thing? And in some of these land use seminars that Craig and I were doing a while back, and a few other folks, you know, one of the things that Craig always said was, a city has a right to be dumb. They can do the stupid thing. It's not illegal. And so that really kind of is the deal here. It may not make a lot of sense to say, well, we'll approve this rezone, but in very similar circumstances, we're not going to approve this one. May not hold a lot of water from a logic or a moral standpoint or even a smartness standpoint, but you have the discretion to do it. And, you know, I think if somebody drags it into court, court's not likely to overturn it, but you really ought to, if you're going to make a decision, give some good rationale, reason, basis why you're not approving it, or why you are approving it if you are approving a rezone, so that the court at least, or somebody has an ability to hang their hat on it and say, well, they had a reason. It may not have been a very good reason. It may not have been a very smart reason, but they had a reason, you know, rather than just, I didn't like the guy.
While
For
we're
what
on
it's
that
worth,
subject of-
let
I'm
me
sorry.
throw a comment in here. A few years ago, the legislature changed the standard of review for legislative acts. The court had declared that it was whether or not it's reasonably debatable that the decision advances the general welfare or it's in the interest of the community. The legislature changed that. Now it says that it furthers the purposes of the Land Use Development Act. And what are the purposes of the land use of LUDMA, the Land Use Management and Development Act? A big one's moderate income housing, for example. I just think there's room for some people to come in and say, look, what you're doing may have made sense in an earlier era, but if it doesn't advance the opportunity of housing for people, if it specifically is against that, it does not further the purposes of LUDMA, for what it's worth.
Well, and with you having said that, Craig, there's been discussion now leading up to the legislative session about putting some more specific language in the state code with regard to LUDMA, saying that one of the primary purposes is to foster affordable housing. So that may lend some more impetus to that very rationale. You were interrupted, Brian.
No, it's fine. I just want to carry on with what Craig just said. That's an interesting thing, and it's an interesting thing to see how that's going to evolve, because I do think it is. But on the last slide, the slide we had before, I just want to go back to something. One of the topics we did not get to is whether or not affordability creates blight. And I just had a conversation with some folks about that. I think that's what people think, and I think that's what a lot of elected officials think, and that's what a lot of neighbors think, and that's why the neighbors don't want smaller units, because they assume that these smaller units are all going to be occupied by drug dealers because they need a place to live, right? When the objective here is teachers and librarians and people who work at the gas station and police officers and stuff like that. And these, I mean, social problems aside, why we should be paying all these people a lot more, we're not, right? And so these are not the middle. These are not the missing middle people that we're talking about. These are the people that need affordability, right? And so, you know, what Craig just said is interesting, and that's why I think it's going to evolve, is because that's who can't afford houses. My kids who can't afford houses, the legislature reacts to that every year and reacts to it every year. And it's part of taking away that level of it's part of what causes that discretion that local governments has to be taken away.
Any other comments on this? Any further? All right, pick another box. Let's talk about something else that's on your mind. Can I move that ditch? Oh, that's a fun one.
Want me to set that up?
Yeah.
So I have a client right now who's coming in and who's buying a bunch of property, and they want to build something on that property, and there's a ditch going down the middle of it. It's just a ditch that serves 2 or 3 farmers, right? And they've walked in thinking, yes, I'm going to buy that property, I'm going to put down all this money, and I'm going to be able to build what I want to build. And this kind of relates to the thing in the top left, should we buy that property, right? From a developer standpoint, right, I had to stop the developer, and I had to say, you've got a huge problem right there. And it's that ditch. And I do want to tie it to that first topic up there. Should we buy that property? You know, something that happens to me frequently. As a developer comes to me and says, I'm about to buy this piece of property. I want you to check and see if I can do X. Another quick experience. I know I'm talking a lot, but another quick experience. Internet zillionaire has come to Utah. This happened to me. Has come to Utah wanting to build something, a compound in Park City, a great compound in Park City. So he came to me and he said, I want you to do land use due diligence. So I did the due diligence. I found that the zoning was fine for what he wanted to do. He might have to do a little, some other things to find what he wanted to do. So I said, generally, I think, yes, you can do that. And so the next week, he called a contractor and had him out there grading. The next week. No applications, no permits, nothing, because I told him that the zoning that he had there matched. So the point is, you have a ditch going across your property. You have other issues when it comes to buying that property. Are you fine? Are you good? What's what would you say to somebody in that boat?
So much of my life has been occupied answering questions from planners and city staff about, can we move that ditch? And from a city perspective, your obligation really, if you just read LUDMA very carefully, your obligation is to make sure the water continues to flow, right? But that is so much, there's so much more complication in that question with ditches. Peter, I love that you're my guy and you asked the question. Thank you. It's really tough because a lot of the ditches in this state that are carrying water are not covered by a written easement that describes the ditch. A lot of the ditches that you find on property in this state haven't carried water for a number of years, but somebody still has a right for the water to flow in the ditch. If you have a ditch on the property that is covered by a described easement, and the ditch is in the easement, which is rare, by the way, the described easement often doesn't encompass where the ditch actually is. But if you have that situation as a city, I think your obligation kind of amps up, and I don't know if it's good enough to just tell the developer or the property owner, as long as the water flows, our hands are off. I think you maybe have a deeper obligation. So the answer is, it depends, I think. And it's one of the harder questions that you'll face in dealing with a piece of property. Primarily, strictly to the code, make sure the water continues to flow, right? But there's a lot of nuance to it.
Peter has a follow-up.
And Brandon had a question too.
Hey, Peter, hang on just a sec so we get a mic over to you.
With most of these ditches carrying irrigation water, and whether it's a ditch company or an irrigation company, what about the commingling of surface water that runs and connects into a ditch or a pipe?
And by commingling of surface water, you mean the city's stormwater?
No. From these, infill, leftover, vacant, larger lots that are being developed around them, and the surface water from these farm pieces is going into said irrigation ditch.
Yeah. I have always tried really, really hard not to have my clients regulating those relationships. I've bent over backwards not to have my clients, my municipal clients, regulating those relationships. I've looked at those and said those are private matters and they need to stay that way. And there's not much in the state code that would give us any guidance on that issue anyway. I always want my municipal clients to step back from that and not engage in that. You will, the situation where there are those old ditches or canals and city stormwater has been running in there forever, create all sorts of difficulty, right? Those are really, really hard to manage over time. And I don't know if everybody else who's ever practiced law in this state is like me, but the relationships with those canal and ditch companies are not always easy. That's an understated way of saying it, right? Jody's laughing in the back. She's had in my life before. They're not always easy. So, my advice to my clients is always clean up your storm drain systems, take them out of canals and ditches where you can. Let's find a different way to do this. And I think when you're looking at those ditches on property, you need to understand the nature of them quite well. If there is no easement recorded on the property for the ditch, I think you can say, look, all we can do as a city is make sure the water continues to run, right? That's our obligation. When there's an easement and it covers the ditch, then I think maybe our obligation amps up a little bit. And we need to do what we can to make sure the developer is aware of the easement. And I don't know that I would go so far as to say defend the easement, but I think we have a little bit more obligation to that ditch in that circumstance.
So I'm given the history of how our state and our area has developed over the years, and much of the land that's developing now has been agricultural for so long, and ditches were all over the place. And I think because those people got involved in their local city or county government, and I had early in my career I saw a lot of ordinances that said for a subdivision of property you had to get a sign off from the ditch or irrigation company. It was required before you to approve a subdivision. That eventually got challenged by property owners and developers saying, how come they have basically a chokehold on approving a development? And it really didn't make a lot of sense for a lot of the reasons that Todd just talked about. And eventually we did get some language into the state code which talks about, I think what it says now, and Cam, maybe you'll have to remind or help me on this. I think it says that you now have to notify the ditch company, but that's about it. But if there is a ditch there or there's an easement or something conveying water, you have to notify the owner of that, and that's it.
And you can't require a signature of people unless they own the property
Or have an interest in it.
or have an interest in the property.
An easement's an interest.
And an easement is an interest,
that's
which
right.
is a ditch.
But as you said, a lot of ditches don't have any kind of an easement. They're just there.
There is a state code provision, and I can't quote chapter and verse about what you have to do if you want to move a ditch, and the ditch company is not cooperative. Does anybody know where that is? Rick does? Yeah, that sounds right. It's in the water code, and the
73-1, 1521? 15.1.
The ombudsman is mentioned. Rick Plin, by the way, is one of our property rights ombudsmen. And the ombudsman is mentioned in that code, but what it basically says, just to summarize, is if you want to move a ditch, you can't just move it. You have to engineer it, and you have to engineer the old ditch and the new ditch to make sure there's not going to be any water loss, and that there's not going to be any problem going around corners and all that kind of stuff if you want to move a ditch. But it is there. Yes, Rick.
And I'll just add interesting fact of the day regarding that statute. That is one of the only instances where the Ombudsman's office would mediate between two private property owners. The statute has
The
basically...
developer and the ditch company.
Right. So over that question of that statute and whether it's been complied with or if there's a dispute, our office can mediate a dispute. And usually we're mediating eminent domain disputes between either a government entity or like a public utility. But in this case, two private property owners, we can mediate that kind of a dispute.
Awesome.
Any follow-up? Anything else on that one? All right, let's pick another one. What else? Oh, we got a couple of hands here. Let's take the one in the front first, Bill, then we'll come back to you.
Live thing going on right now with the developer. Have you seen that county or so that they still have?
So this is a question about in a situation where you've got a developer attempting to develop about 2,000 acres. They are in an attempt to control that better. They're going to the lieutenant governor's office and applying for or initiating a process to create what's called a preliminary municipality, which is something that was just recently put into the state code, I think for a specific purpose. And yeah, and the question really is, have we seen that and what can be done about that? Todd, sounds like you might know. You don't?
I've never seen it. I don't know what you can do. It's the old company town, right? That's what they're doing. And you know, the law was passed last year during the last session. I've not dealt with one yet. I don't know what you could do, to be honest with you. So
I'm with you. I've heard a lot of people talking about it. I definitely have, though, seen people try to incorporate in order to make their own rules, and everything else happens all the time.
every incorporation in the state is based on some kind of idea like that, right? Yeah. Dave Church used to say that Hooper should really be called not Roy, because they incorporated because they didn't want to be encroached on by Roy and what they were doing. Every city incorporates for some kind of reason like that. And over the last several years, it frequently has been over, you know, desires to do something relating to development. So.
Yeah, there are a couple of different incorporation efforts ongoing in the state right now, and a lot of it is because they want to control their own destiny, so to speak, their development potential. The situation you're talking about with this preliminary municipality, you know, because in the state code for incorporating, you have to have a certain number of people and you have to do all of this stuff. Well, a new development's not going to have that. And so this was a way to kind of get around that, I guess. And like Todd says, that's new and we really haven't experienced yet. And I think it was created specifically for those kinds of situations.
Taking the preliminary factor out of the equation, okay, is there a way for a county to stop an incorporation?
I mean, I don't know of a way that they can stop incorporation, really. I mean, you have to do the study, you have to do all of the requirements, and there may be pitfalls in the requirements, but
People who live in parts of Mill Creek right now might say that Salt Lake County was pretty effective for a long time in stopping the incorporation of Mill Creek, but it wasn't through a statutory process. They used other means to do that, you know.
Could you elaborate? They
were political. They were really political about it, and the process as it was set up was tough on its face. And the original Mill Creek incorporation efforts were, you know, Mill Creek's a big city. It covers a lot of territory, and it reaches east to west really a long ways, right, Mayor? I mean, you've got a broad reach. And so those incorporation efforts, the signature gathering and the election were hard. And so I just would characterize it was kind of a political battle to defeat that incorporation the first time it went. So,
Any of you back row geniuses know anything? They are geniuses back there, by the way.
So that's a political question that I prefer to dodge, perhaps, right? You know, we're incorporated now, though. That's the good news.
Cam? Hang on, we're getting him the mic.
on the issue of the preliminary municipalities, you're right, it was new last session. There's already dialogue about potentially extending that in this upcoming session. It only applies in rural counties, so counties of the third class and smaller, and then there are several different pieces that were built into that legislation. So even though we as a league didn't take a position on it, because for us, we start to care when it actually becomes a municipality. This was really trying to say, if you can't reach the old threshold of 100 residents, is there a way to start the process of incorporation? And then after a certain period of time, if you haven't met these benchmarks, then you're back to being an unincorporated area. And Wilf, you're spot on. It came because of several fact patterns off the Wasatch Front of property owners that were trying to develop their property, but they didn't have willing partners with the service districts or with the counties therein. So there's always a story behind legislation, but there were different within that framework, there were several different parameters put in to really limit where this could apply, and there's a cap annually at the number of preliminary municipalities. But I could see this trend growing, not shrinking, because of the point Todd was making around the company town piece. And if you've got an area that could be self-sufficient, right now that the history of the 100 residents to incorporate also has a bit of a tortured past, and the legislature just in my career has been like this over how big you have to be to incorporate. So I view this as just kind of the latest in that cycle of at what point can you self-determine versus being tied to what the service district or what a county can provide to you if you want to incorporate. So stay tuned. I think this issue will just get bigger and bigger.
That's great, Cam. That's great.
All right. Bill, let's go to yours.
Annexation is up there. I know that's everybody's favorite. I know that's everyone's favorite. We have a situation that we're looking at in Tremont, and annexation has kind of come up. And the question I have is related to annexation is how much does what the developer want to have happen with their property weigh into whether or not a certain community annexes the property or not? So if for example, just purely hypothetical, let's say that Tremont has a better regulatory environment than a neighboring smaller community. But the annexation boundary makes no sense. My planner sitting next to me said it makes no sense. The annexation boundary is largely in this other community, which has a less favorable, for the developer, less favorable regulatory environment. And so they want to annex into Tremont potentially. How much does that weigh into the decision of where they get annexed?
So let me preface by saying with annexation, first of all, if you look at the annexation section of the state code, it's a bloody mess. It's just really hard to understand and to make sense of. And that's because it's been modified for all kinds of political reasons so many times over the years. The primary driver being the big annexation wars that happened in Salt Lake County in the 90s and the early 2000s. So really the first goal that a lot of us have had is just clean up that section and get it make more sense and get some of the contradictory or policies out of there that no longer really need to be there out. And there's a draft that's out there that's being worked on at the state office now to try and do that. Now, with the status of the current annexation law, really it's almost entirely driven by the property owner in terms of where does the property owner want to annex to. And if a city is willing to annex a property owner who wants to be annexed in, there are some requirements that they have to meet, one of which is they have to be incorporated in their annexation plan. If you have overlapping plans, it can be annexed into either community, and it really just kind of determines a working it out of the two communities and the property owner as to who's going to take it and how and when. So it really is up to the property owner, and then the municipality just has to be willing to do it and follow some basic procedural steps in order to be able to annex it. So that's the short answer to your question. But annexation annexation can really be a tool for guiding and managing growth. In a number of other states, it has been made much more of a tool like that. And we really could and should do the same thing here. We had a working group that was looking at the annexation code, and that was one of the things that we continually talked about was, you know, we really should be doing this with the annexation code. And we always had to come back and say, it's a good idea, but that's not what we're going to try to do right now. But I think we need to get there to try to make some of those changes. And maybe we'll get there one of these days.
So I'll ask Brendan Wilf. I don't know the answer to this question because I've specifically tried not to put my nose in the annexation code very often. But does the Boundary Commission have a role in Box Elder County?
What?
If there's a protest filed, does the Boundary Commission have a role?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so my point would be, having been in front of boundary commissions a few times, I have had some who have given great weight to what the property owner wanted, and I have had others who seem to give no weight at all to what the property owner wanted. So I agree the process and is largely driven by the property owner, but when you get in front of a boundary commission, I kind of think it's a different game a little bit. So
Yeah, that's true.
To me, I think Todd's exactly right, and it even goes deeper than that. Annexation is an interesting animal because you can't have annexation unless a property owner asks for that, except for a 418 annexation, right? But normally in annexation, a property owner has to ask for it, and they have to meet the qualifications, right? But on the other hand, an annexation is under legislative discretion, which means that the property owner asks for it, the property owner drives it forward, but the local government has absolutely no obligation to do what the property owner wants to do. Because since it's a legislative thing, the local government can move the boundary. They can say, we're annexing you and not annexing you. And this is a source of a lot of tension right now between developers and local governments, because one thing that they sometimes will use that legislative discretion for is to ask for things that they couldn't exact for. Sure, we'll annex you if you give us $1 million park, right? And technically that's not illegal. Is it smart? Is it the right thing to do? I don't know, but that's a source of a lot of tension. The property owner drives it, but it's legislative discretion, so it's all up to what the local government wants to do. And that came to head in an experience I had, where I had a client who wanted to annex about a 10-acre piece, to put 25 homes in an area, and the spot was great, but the county immediately protested because they weren't annexing enough, because the county wanted all the area around that to be annexed and out of their hair. And so in order to be helpful, in order to get rid of this protest, my client said, okay, fine, we'll annex the whole thing. And of course the neighborhood went nuts. We don't want to be annexed. Why are you annexing us? And they had this idea that the developer was going to come and develop the entire county and put up thousands of homes and all this kind of stuff. And we had to go to the Boundary Commission, and I had to say to the Boundary Commission, look, we're only here with this annexation boundary because that's what the county wants. We want this little 10-acre piece, and that's all we want. And the Boundary Commission ended up having to deny the annexation, and so had to completely start over. So that's a source of a lot of tension, to get to Bill's question.
And that goes again to the whole issue of we need to readdress our annexation laws so that they can be a better tool for managing growth in our communities and around our communities. We have the one box up there that says they must annex if I'm in their plan, in their boundary. Well, you have to be in their plan in order to have your property annexed into the community. But if your property is in their plan, they don't have to annex you. It's a completely discretionary action, legislative discretionary action. So I've been talked to by several people in the last couple of months where they're saying, we want to develop this property. Everybody thinks it's a good idea, but the city and it's in their plan for annexation, but the city doesn't want to annex them right now. Isn't there something we can do about that? And the answer I have to give them is no, there really isn't. It's discretionary. And so, something we need to look at, I think, to really help us to be more effective managers of growth. Any other comments? The question back here, yeah. Hang on. We got the Craig, if we can get a mic over to her.
Craig was asleep. Just give him a second to wake up.
If I'm in their plan for future annexation, do I have to annex into their city, or can I choose a neighbor?
You could choose a neighbor, but it would also have to be in their annexation policy plan. Now, I have seen the situation where a property owner is in one city's plan, but they would rather annex into another city. So they go talk to the other city and get them to amend their plan so that they'll also include them, and then they can annex them into their city.
However, that does become a negotiation between the two cities.
Yeah, usually there's some politics involved there.
I recently had a situation where a client was in someone's annexation policy plan, and they applied for annexation, and the city said, let me see what you're going to do. And they showed them what they were going to do, and immediately they took them out of their annexation policy plan.
They're not going to annex them. Linda?
This may or may not be hypothetical.
Fair enough.
Okay.
So what happens when there's an area of the county that the county doesn't want, and neither do any of the surrounding municipalities? I know there's really not an answer, but
Yeah, I mean, what do you do?
their only hope is that they can be a preliminary municipality.
Oh, yeah, I guess, well, yeah, with the code, but the code limits where that can happen at this point. But
Oh,
Cam is indicating there may be some discussions to expand that coming up, so.
The county has to keep the garbage.
that's a great answer.
You know I say things like that just to provoke, right?
All right, any other things on annexation while we're on this topic? Anything? Question over here. Megan. Craig's on his way, Megan.
What about city services to future annexation areas?
So it's possible, there are situations where cities have been providing services outside of their city boundaries to unincorporated property. Where that has happened, where it's called, in the code, it's called municipal services. Where a municipality has been providing municipal services for more than a year to property outside the municipality, they then are able to annex that property into the municipality without a petition. The city can just decide to annex it.
That's the 418 annexation that I talked about, that I mentioned a second ago.
But the city doesn't have to. They don't have to annex it. They can if they want to.
So what if the property owner doesn't want to annex in? Do they really have a leg to stand on after a year?
Not on a 418. The city can just take them. With regard to other annexations, and this is where we had a boundary commission case that Brent was involved with. I'm on the boundary commission in Davis County. You propose an annexation, a property wants to annex into a community, and there's other properties between them and the community. So the property owner that wants to annex, they propose an annexation to get to the community that includes some other properties, and some of those other property owners don't want to annex. Can they be forced in? It all depends on the value of the property and the total area. There's a couple of thresholds on value and on total area. And if the property seeking to be annexed, or the property that agrees to be annexed, is greater than those who don't want to be annexed, those who don't want to be annexed can be forced into an annexation. If they don't, They can protest it and probably keep themselves out of the annexation. They can stymie the annexation. Couple of questions. Yeah, let's go back here where the mic is, and then we'll come up to you.
One point, in Salt Lake County, you don't need an annexation plan.
Yeah, well, that's, if what is proposed in this upcoming legislation, that'll change. Salt Lake County will then be the same as the rest of the state.
But that is the case.
But it is the case right now. You are correct. And then we had a question over here.
The struggle with that threshold now, because we've got, in Tremont, we've got an annexation that when the development on the coattails of it will be worth more than the current houses that need to be involved. So I guess a little bit more background is 4 or 5 years ago, a developer didn't want to build all the infrastructure for city standards. And so he elected to stay out in the county. Now, downhill of that, south of that, a new developer's come in, wanted to annex in 70 acres, but because of the house values of the finished property, we can't get to that threshold until the development's done. And so those 20 houses that now are eligible for municipal services because of somebody else's pocketbooks can hold up 70 acres of development that in the future will trump in value. And so that's kind of the frustrations we've had right now. And I guess what's the best way to approach those, 20 houses that say, okay, this is to your long-term benefit because your septic tanks will fail. We don't have that much difference between where your tanks are and the groundwater. So I guess, is there any insight, or does anyone have a magic wand as to help with stubbornness?
So you're just describing one of the many irrationalities of our annexation law in the state, and one of the things that ought to be addressed and fixed, so to speak. But it's not the case now. The very thing you're talking about is very possible. A lot of what you're talking about is similar to in some ways to the kinds of things that were happening in Salt Lake County that caused such big annexation wars, where there were certain properties that wanted to annex, but a lot of other folks that didn't want to annex, even though it made sense to annex, and they stayed out. And I mean, it really gets ugly, and you really find yourself saying, this just doesn't make any sense. Maybe we can get to making sense someday, but it doesn't right now.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you.
So I've been involved in a couple of annexations like that, and what the members of the city council would do is go out and find some other property owners that want in, and you meet your value and your area, and you steamroll them.
But you can do, for sure.
Did you say steamroll?
Steamroll, it's a technical word, it's a legal term.
It's in the code, right? All right. Anything else? Any others? We got about 45 minutes left in our session. Shall we move on to the last category, Brent?
Anyone more on this one?
Anything else anybody wants to raise on any of these? Question here.
Thanks, Craig. I think this might be a good transition between the municipal concerns and the neighbor concerns, but several times in this session you've talked about tools for municipalities to direct and control growth. And maybe that could be the transition between these two topics.
That's good.
All right, that's good. Well, so here we are. Here we have the categories for the myths of the neighbors.
Can we stop development is right there.
That's a big one. That's one that we hear probably the most is, the neighbors want to stop development. The example we used at the beginning was one of those.
I have this presentation that I've sometimes done called The Wheel of Democracy, and that's a tongue-in-cheek title to it. But what this presentation basically says is this is how things happen. a person says, I want to stop development, and in order to do that, I'm going to run for office, for city council. And they get elected every time, it seems like. That's the best way to get elected for city council, is to say, I'm going to stop development. And then they get on the city council, try to stop development for a while, and the city ends up getting sued or something or whatever. But after some time, they pretty soon learn that they can't. They can't stop development, which means that at the next election, they're out. They get voted out because someone came along and said, I'm going to stop development and I'm going to get elected. So my short answer to that question, can we stop development and what tools can we use? First of all, you can't stop it. You can't stop it. Second of all, there are things you can do to manage it. But you have to be careful about what those things are, because there is kind of a fine line between trying to manage it and trying to stop it, right? And people in this country have property rights, right? And don't forget, I mean, I say this a lot of times, I've said this for many, many years in all the trainings that I've done, some at some of your cities. The rule in this country is property rights. The rule in this country is I can do what I want with my land. The exception to that rule is city ordinances. That is when the city is allowed to make a rule that controls what you can and cannot do, but that's not the rule. That's the exception to the rule of I get to do what they want. That is why if you haven't put it in an ordinance, if you haven't said somebody can't do it, you can, right? Because that's the rule, right? And so that's the thing to consider about when you get someone, an elected official or some people who are lined up at city council meeting who, why can't you just say no to this? You can't. You can't stop it.
Brent, we don't talk about controlling development. We talk about guiding and regulating
Managing.
development. Yeah, we use different terms. I think the realistic answer to can we stop development is maybe for a short time. And it's expensive, and it doesn't hold up for very long. So that's been my experience. You might be able to stop it for a time. I don't think in realistic terms it's long-term successful. And so we always try to point our elected officials towards that notion that we're not controlling development. We're guiding it and we're regulating it in the best way we can. And Brent is right. Councils have cycles sometimes, and there's a little bit of animosity towards development for a time, and then sometimes it swings not all the way or another way, but more towards the middle. We see those things frequently. I haven't seen a community that I've watched closely that I think has been successful in stopping development for any long period of time. And with the current circumstance we have right now, I think they're likely to be less successful than they would have been in the past, I guess is what I would say. There are a ton of tools that the public can employ to try and slow things down or to try and stop things. And, for a long time in this state, we had this huge uptick of referenda that were filed. I don't think we're seeing as many as we used to see. They're still out there, but we don't see as many as we used to see. That can slow things down sometimes. It doesn't very often stop the process. And so when I talk to my councils, I try not to ever create an impression that we can stop this. I'm more often working with administrators and planners and folks to say, how do we guide this to the outcome we've envisioned and that we think is appropriate for our community, right? We're not talking about stopping it very often.
Can I? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, let me quickly say, here we go again. Over my long and storied career, one of the things that I've seen, and that's always just confounded me, a lot of communities, when they start to grow, they're not excited about the growth. And so they want to do what they can to stop it. or slow it down or something. And so what they do is they fail to plan for growth. They fail to manage it because they think they're going to stop it, but they ultimately can't stop it. And by the time they finally come to that realization, they've made a lot of mistakes. A lot of things that could have been a whole lot better in their community are now in place because they weren't managing that growth effectively, because they were just trying to stop it instead of deal with it. And so that was one frustration. But as I would see that happen in one community, and then there'd be other communities over here that weren't growing yet, but then they'd start growing, and I'd think, okay, this is the opportunity now for this community that's starting to grow. They can look back on what happened with this community over here and say, let's not make the same mistakes those guys made. And damn if they don't do exactly the same thing and make the same mistakes. Because everybody seems to think they can stop the growth, and it doesn't work. The best thing you can do is manage that growth effectively to create a community that is worth living in, that you'll like to live in, or at least like somewhat. Maybe not as much as that rural community as it used to be, but better than it might wind up if you don't do something to effectively manage that growth. So to say you're going to stop growth, give it up. It's not going to happen. Managing that growth is really what you ought to be shooting for.
One quick anecdote. And there's somebody in this room that's very close to this situation, even closer than I am, so that person can correct me, and there may be more, but there's a situation I'm aware of where a group of citizens got together and incorporated for the sole purpose of stopping growth. And the incorporation was successful, but the city, once the incorporation was successful, the city got together, the city councilors were elected, and very quickly realized that they couldn't. And now the group that was incorporating are in a constant state of threatening to sue the city that they started, because the city is allowing things to happen that the whole reason why they incorporated wasn't going to happen. And that's an illustration of how this sometimes happened. What Wilf said was really profound. Do not think that that good planning means you're surrendering to growth, because all that's going to do is leave you in a bad situation if you fail to plan because you want to stop growth.
There we go. Any other comments on this? Questions, comments on this topic? All right, pick another box. What do we want to talk about now?
Chase.
It's not on there, but public hearings.
Ah, public hearings. One of my favorites.
You have to listen.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Public input and public hearings, all of the public input, the things that are involved in our land use processes. It's a mixed bag, and it's a mixed bag because I think a lot of times our communities don't understand it. It's really kind of a founding or a core principle that citizens get to address their government, that they get to go and talk to their officials, whether they're planning commissions or council people or whatever, that they get to express their opinion and their feelings. And to that end, I think over the years, and this was particularly true early on in my career, land use ordinances allowed for or even required public hearings for everything. Conditional use permits, subdivision plats, site plans, rezones, everything required a public hearing. When we got a better understanding between administrative and legislative functions, and part of that is based on the fact that if you have something in your code that a property owner is allowed to do, and Brent talked about this, unless you say that you can't do something or have to do something a certain way in your code, a property owner can really do whatever they want because of property rights. But once you put it in your code and you've given people certain rights to do, they have a right to do it. So why would that be subject to the opinions and the comments of the public around them? And so when we got a little bit of a better understanding that in a lot of these administrative processes, we've given certain rights to these people or to these property owners, and there really isn't a point any longer of having that public discussion, debate. It's been decided. And so we've got a little bit more of a division now of saying, look, for administrative items, and even in the state code, for administrative items, public hearings are not required. For legislative items, they are, because those are discretionary policy-related kinds of issues. So what do we do with regard to that? We still have, in a lot of communities, we still hold public hearings for administrative items.
I think most.
Yeah, maybe most. It's almost a disservice to the public, because people think that if they can come and talk to you about it and express their opinion, and that's almost always what they do when they come, is they express their opinion. Not often do they bring facts. Sometimes they do, but not often. Expressing their opinion on somebody's right to do something is counterproductive.
And it also keeps us all there till 11 p.m.
And it provides a lot of work for these guys, because for the attorneys, because of, you deny somebody their right to do something, and that person's going to say, hey, I'll see you in court. I have a right to do that. And so should we be holding public hearings for administrative items? My contention is we should not. But I know Brent has a little bit of a different feeling on this, and he'll probably express that. But there's got to be some rationale or basis behind it, and people need to understand what the purpose is behind that. For legislative items, absolutely. Public hearings and public input of all different kinds is appropriate, and probably even necessary in order to get the feel and the will of the people of the community.
But for a legislative item, that still doesn't mean you have to listen to them. You have to hold a public hearing, but you can ignore them if you want.
So that's kind of where we're at, the difference between the two. So go ahead, Brent, express your. Let's go to Todd.
Brent said we could ignore them. I wouldn't advise my clients to ignore them. But what I do think we do that's a total disservice, I agree with Wilf totally on public hearings on administrative items. We invite the public in, we ask them to give us their input, and then we say, thank you, but your input didn't matter. That's the worst thing you can do, right? I think that's a bad practice. And I know we preserve the right for municipalities to hold a public hearing on subdivisions in the most recent revisions we did. And I think a lot of cities and towns have done that. I hope over time they really consider that hard. Because we're inviting the public in and we're saying we want your input, and then we're telling them the input you gave us was, I'm sorry, but it doesn't matter. So I think that's just a bad thing to do. I think it's counterproductive, like Wilf said. The other thing that I think, and it always illustrates this, I'll never forget this, but my former law partner's here today, and there was a time where we were representing a remarkably high-growth community at the same time. She went to planning commission meetings every week. I went to council meetings every week. And we would always come back and talk about the 8 or 9 or 10 subdivision applications that were on an agenda every single meeting. And the thing that was, you could write down every time, was that somebody in a brand new house next to the property that was ready to be subdivided would come in and say, we've got to stop this growth. In a brand new house.
Call that the gangplank.
Yeah, so I mean, those kind of things are, for administrative items, we don't need it. But we also don't need to do the public hearings on the legislative items the way we're doing them.
True.
It is perfectly appropriate. There's nothing in the statute that says on a legislative item public hearing you have to listen to every interested person. We have to do that on a tax increase in a city, but nothing in the state code says we have to do that on a land use item that's legislative in nature. So it's perfectly appropriate for a council on their agenda to set aside a certain amount of time for a public hearing on an item. And they don't all have to be the same. Not every rezone has to be treated the same. If Mill Creek is rezoning their city center for their large project, they can set aside 2 hours for that. And if they're rezoning a small piece of property somewhere else that's in the interior, that's an infill residential project, they don't have to set aside 2 hours for that. They can set aside a reasonable amount of time for that item. And they can listen to as many people as they need to within that time. So I think we're not always, even on those items where we should be taking public comment, I don't know that we're always doing it right. I also think we're not always inviting the right kind of comment with the way we introduce a public hearing. I think we could do better on that end, far better on that end, by telling the public what is helpful to the council, what they expect to hear. If you have a subdivision application and you're still doing a public hearing, please tell the public that comes that you're looking for the application to meet the ordinances of the city or the town. And that's what this public hearing is for, is to determine whether or not the application is consistent with the ordinances. If you don't like the fact that we're putting third-acre lots there, we're past that point now. We're talking about whether or not the application complies with the ordinance. I don't think we're very good at that yet, and I think we could be better.
So Todd, that's kind
So
of an
I'm going
interesting idea. Oh, yeah, Mayor, go
So
ahead.
as the fellow that faces the pitchforks and the torches, I have a lot of views on this. So first of all, I agree with some of what's been set up there. There is a limit to how many public hearings there should be on an administrative matter. However, I will say that either planning commissions or city councils frequently learn things in public comment on administrative matters that actually help establish good conditions to make a project better, and very often can resolve neighborhood concerns and reach a compromise with the developer. And I have an example of that where there was a question about building a bank in Mill Creek, and the citizen comment suggested that if the egress was at this location, it was going to complicate traffic at an intersection that was a little unusual, but if it was over here, it would be better. Now that is the kind of public comment that we look for, that was helpful. It made the project better, and we wouldn't have learned that if we didn't have public comment on an administrative matter. I think what I will say is that, and I don't want to criticize my peers, but a lot of this is a matter of leadership in local government, and the person running the meeting setting ground rules for the public comment, and also doing a better job of explaining, like Todd said, what the council is looking for, what the planning commission is looking for. What are the parameters of our decision? There are a lot of decisions like CUP, conditional use permit, where really, unless it's an extreme case, it cannot be denied. Okay, it must be granted, and all we can do is fashion reasonable conditions to mitigate impact. And if that kind of stuff is explained to people at the beginning so that they understand, look, you may hate this project, but no matter how much you hate it, we are going to have to approve it with conditions, unless we can't mitigate the harm. So a lot of that's leadership, okay, in terms of setting the parameters of ground rules on that. And I agree it should be limited, but I also think that that there is a fundamental aspect to our democracy in allowing people to address public officials and having things heard, and sometimes it's just venting, okay? And those of us who are seasoned can sit up there and listen to the venting and separate the wheat from the chaff there about what we can pay attention to and what we can't. And I'll admit it's an art, and I admit it's not easy, but democracy sometimes isn't easy, and I think if you disenfranchise people by not giving them a voice, it's a mistake.
That sounds like group therapy, Mayor.
Can I respond to that, please? Or go ahead, Lynn.
I appreciate it. As a former elected official myself, I would concur with what Mayor Silvestrini said. One of the challenges you face is having the public think that you're making these decisions without any input, or you're in the dark, or you're in the pocket of the developer. The other thing I guess I want to add is that not all administrative hearings are the same. So in a conditional use hearing, the Planning Commission is charged with imposing conditions to mitigate adverse impacts. How do you know what those are unless you ask the citizens, what are the potential adverse impacts of this project? And if the neighbor comes in and says, those lights from the gas station are going to shine in my bedroom window, then we know we need to ask them to create and construct a masonry wall to block the headlights, right? But there's a purpose for these hearings, and I would agree with the mayor that as long as the people conducting those hearings focus people on the purposes of the hearing, then we've accomplished that. But I think just saying that all administrative hearings should not have any input from the public is too broad a brush.
So, okay, I still have something to say, but I want to hear what you guys have to say too.
Hold on.
Okay. So because the planning commission members are volunteer and not elected officials, why do we have to have public hearings at both planning commission and city council?
You're not
We
required
don't?
to. You're not. The state code only requires on legislative items that the planning commission hold a public hearing.
Legislative items at planning commission, that's the only requirement.
That's the only requirement. The council is not required to hold a public hearing on legislative items. Most do, which is smart, but they're not required to by state code. But the planning commissions are required to for legislative items.
And if the track record is no one shows up, can they be canceled?
Well, they just say, open public hearing, nobody here, close the public hearing, you're done.
Okay.
Okay. So, my response is this. When I was at the Ombudsman's office, arguments like the one that Mayor Silvestrini and Lynn had me convinced that there were two reasons to hold public hearings for administrative items. And one is so the people feel like they got heard. And the other is just in case you get some good information that makes a difference. And those are both great arguments, but I want to tell you, and Wilf's going to be surprised to hear this, that I'm leaning more towards not lately. And here's the reason, okay? I don't think we can just cut them off because people do have an expectation that they should be able to speak, right? But we need to wean them off of that, in my opinion, because the expectation that they should be able to speak at an administrative hearing gives them the illusion that what they say matters, okay? And just venting is not enough for the resources and everything, but we can't just cut them off. But I do think we need to change how we approach it. And the point that the mayor made about leadership is how to do that. But I do think we need to work towards helping people understand that you're not entitled to anything here, including speaking, right? Because we're just enabling an unhealthy behavior, is what it is. And the second reason why I'm sort of moving away from this idea that you have to let them speak in case they point out something that you need. I mean, that's a great point. But I think that we need to do that in a different way. Besides making people know that you can come and say your piece, and we'll try to pick through the useful things and figure out what those are, right? And I don't know what that different way is, and leadership is a big part of that too. But as far as receiving facts and information, which they can base the decision on, evidence, right? There should be a way for people to get that to us. There's got to be a better way to do that than to spend 4 hours listening to people holler just to get one little tidbit.
Well, and that gets me to the question that I had for Todd with what he was saying about the way to conduct the public hearings. I'm thinking like when you do a general plan update, a lot of times we'll do have community open houses and things like that. Would that qualify as being a public hearing?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the structure of our code suggests a city council meeting in front of the full council, the public hearing. I think that's there. I have talked to my clients a lot of times about sort of a UDOT, and I hate to raise the UDOT method of public hearing where you can submit written comments in addition to the open public hearing at a council meeting. I've not found a great way for staffs to manage all of that yet. I think that's still hard. But we have a ways to go in the way we conduct our public hearings. And would that every city had a mayor like Mayor Silvestrini. I'm fortunate, I'm blessed to work in cities right now that have outstanding mayors that really do control and handle their meetings extremely well. I haven't left a city council meeting at 11:30 at night in a few years, and that's a real blessing. But
I have.
Yeah, it's one of those things that is hard. I have seen valuable points come out of administrative hearings. It's so rare in the subdivision context that I'm willing to just say I'm not won over yet. It is frequent in the conditional use process, actually. And that is a different animal. So, but I think it is more of a management issue right now than maybe it is a structural issue, I guess is what I would say.
I just want to address Brent's comment about a better way to do public hearings. I wouldn't say public hearings formally, but there is a process for development and gaining input that isn't really widely spread used here in Utah, but is used in different regions of the country, and it's referred to as a charrette. And it's essentially a design workshop, and it's typically used for walkable, more urban developments, and because they know that they're going to be addressing this issue of NIMBYism and the neighbors and how they're going to feel about it. And it's amazing how much opposition you can neutralize if you invite someone into the table and allow them to assist in the creation of the project. I recognize that in the land use arena, we get a little tense about that because we start thinking about our rights and things like that. But the challenge is at the end of the day, you're either going to get that input up front, which is where a charrette and design workshop occurs, or you're going to get at the end where it's going to be more legalistic and there's already been money invested in there. You have fewer options that are cheap to resolve the issue, right? But it acknowledges the fact that the neighbors are affected by the process, and therefore, even though you're not legally required to, it may be wise to invite them into the circle and have a greater role in participating in the process. And I had the same thought earlier when we were talking about, I think it was on the city comments about, or the city myths that you mentioned, is that, I've made this comment before, and I'm working to try and implement this in one particular instance right now, that, if we're doing our general plan or we're doing a master plan of some sort, on the city side, we're probably not going to be the ones developing that in most cases. So we ought to invite all the developers we are aware of to sit down, and once we have a near final draft or something close to it, to say, what are the impracticalities that you say that don't compromise the core vision of what we've come up with, but make it more buildable? If essentially when you pass an ordinance or a master plan, you are in a sense still going to be shopping for a developer because someone's going to have to play by those rules. And so it's to your best interest to vet it through the other side of the team and refuse to demonize them and bring them into the conversation, whether it's the public or a developer.
So I kind of gave the impression that I'm just saying we shouldn't be holding public hearings for administrative items at all, and only for legislative. But I got to tell you that I think I'm more in the camp of, over the last couple of years that I've done some research on this, I look at what they do in North Carolina and a few other states where they have a distinction between the what they call, what we would consider just to be a general public hearing, like for a legislative item, and then they have administrative public hearings. They actually outline and say, these public hearings are intended to get information and data and input on this specific process, not to get your general opinion on things. And they actually have it structured that way so that you hold what's called an administrative hearing in North Carolina, and something like that may be something we should look at doing. Craig? Cam?
I just wanted to add one little wrinkle to this conversation on legislative, administrative, and the role of public comment. Several years ago, the legislature actually considered a bill that in its original form would have required public comment in every public meeting that any entity held in the state of Utah. And we had to work closely with our counterparts in the Property Rights Coalition to help articulate to legislators why public comment wasn't appropriate in certain settings within local government. But that was an extremely heavy lift on our end to help the legislature understand that you don't necessarily need public comment everywhere, anytime, any place, because that was the direction they were going with that bill. By extension, you referenced the subdivisions bill from a couple of years ago and the one public hearing that's required. That bill likely would not have passed if it had 0 public hearings in it, because the legislature was very concerned about the perception of taking away the expectation of the public to weigh in. So I ultimately think we got to a good policy outcome, even though you can still do that public hearing on subdivisions, but there was that perception at the legislature of we want to preserve this expectation. So Brent, when you were talking about revisiting that expectation for the public, it's not just the public, it's also the state policymakers when it comes to public comment.
It'll take a generation, I think, to make any real headway. A generation of good, strong leadership to make any headway in that regard. But I think the way we do it right now is enabling. And I'll add one more thing, kind of following into what you said. And if anybody wants to discuss this, if they can, if you don't want to discuss this, I'm challenging you to come and convince me. I remain baffled as to why in any circumstance there would be a public hearing at a land use appeal hearing. Baffled. So come talk to me if you want to talk about that and convince me I'm wrong. Just, I don't know why we would ever do that.
Any other comments on public hearings and public input? Should we move on? We have about 15 minutes left, so let's wrap it up with another topic. What's anybody seeing out there they want to talk about here in the end? Melinda? Hang on, here comes Craig with the mic.
It's not on this board, but the two previous had topics about development agreements. And one of them was, is a flexible development agreement the best? Do I need an attorney? I can't remember the others, but maybe just talk about development agreements. And I know there's been recent legislation that changes to some extent what we can and can't do as a municipality. And I think there's also dialogue about putting additional items in state code.
Great question. So first of all, I'm hoping the developers in the room are not going to hate me for this, but there's often discussion about, what we should say you can and cannot do in a development agreement and what you can agree to in a development agreement. And I'm resistant to that because I think a development agreement ought to be arm's length and things ought to be open. Now, the reason why my developer friends say that is because it's often not arm's length and it's often not open. It's more like you will agree to this or we will not sign your development agreement, and it's something they couldn't otherwise do, right? But I haven't not settled in my mind with exactly how to approach that. But I will say that, when it comes to flexibility in development agreements, and I think the same applies for flexibility in ordinances, I often have clients who say, let's just sort of leave that open so that we can kind of decide what we want to do later. And I advise against that every time, right? The whole point of a development agreement to me is to figure out now what we're going to disagree about later, right? And so if you're saying something like, I'm not sure if we're going to do single family or townhomes down the road, so let's sort of leave that open. And I have to tell my clients, you're just going to have a fight about that, and we're going to have to start over with everything. Figure it out what you want to do now and put that in the development agreement and be as specific as you can. That's not to say that I think development agreements need to be 20, 30, 50 pages. I'm a big believer in simplicity, but I think flexibility to one person is uncertainty to another person, and that goes for ordinances too. Flexibility in ordinances is uncertainty to another person, and that's how fights start.
I like development agreements as a general rule. I don't advise that they be used to work around ordinances. I don't like them to vary the terms of ordinances the way they are. I don't mind an ordinance that enables a development agreement to set what you would otherwise have as ordinance terms. I think that's an appropriate use also. And I always tell my clients, I think you should be willing to entitle this property right up to the level of specificity they're willing to give you about their project. So if they're willing to commit density numbers right now, I'm fine entitling density numbers right now, right? If they're willing to commit to the location of certain kinds of development in a development agreement at a very early stage, I'm willing to entitle that in an agreement. I don't think the development agreements have to detail the fine engineering of a project, but I think you ought to get to that point of specificity, like Brent said, where both parties are comfortable with the entitlement, right? I think that's great. I don't like them varying the terms of ordinances. I think that's wrong. So if you're looking at a development agreement scenario and the reason you want to do it is because your ordinance wouldn't allow it otherwise, fix your ordinance. So that's my feeling on development agreements. I like the planned development zones. I think they're great tools. I don't have a problem in implementing and administering those. I think some of the best projects I've seen in this state are the product of exactly those kinds of zones and agreements. I think they have a really great place in the land use process. I think they're a terrific tool. If a developer comes to me and wants to do a complicated project with a development agreement and they don't have a lawyer, I am so wary and concerned right out of the chute. From the city seat, I would so much prefer that you have able counsel on the development side. It makes everything work better, and you get a better product at the end, candidly. And that enables a full, fair negotiation of all the issues that otherwise I'm uncomfortable having with a property owner who's unrepresented. And at the end of the day, if a property owner comes in and does a complicated development process that results in a development agreement without legal counsel, at some point there's going to be an issue where the expectation wasn't what they thought it was. You know, something's going to happen, and somebody who wasn't part of the process will be picking at the agreement in a way. I just think it's a recipe for bad. So we can't force them to have counsel, but boy, is my job easier and better when they do.
I tell people that they're going to call me either when we do the development agreement or after.
So Todd mentioned that he doesn't like to see development agreements where they try to do things that are not normally allowed in the zone, or trying to get around some of the things that are allowed in the zone, which, you know, I agree with. And we have some language now. I mean, we have seen projects where we have development agreements in place where they are trying to do that, and we have guidance now from court cases and from the code that say if you're going to do something that's not normally allowed in your code with a development agreement, then the development agreement has to go through a legislative process. So in essence, you have to take it to your council and have it approved by your council.
Becomes an ordinance.
It becomes an ordinance. Yeah, it just pretty much becomes an ordinance. But one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of now lately too, in a number of communities, and I'd like to get both of your feedback and anybody else out there, is I see people coming in to request a rezone, and they're asking for something, and the city, the council, they say, okay, but we're going to do a development agreement with it so that that's all you can do. You know, I'm asking for a bakery store in a general commercial zone. Great, we're going to put a development agreement in place that says that's all you can do is a bakery store. And I'm seeing more and more of that where it's basically not getting around the code, it's just saying you only get to do certain parts of the code by agreement. What are your feelings on that?
Lynn will remember my feelings on this really well. I don't like that. I have
another battery.
I have clients who have used development agreements in similar situations to that, but I've only ever really not thrown a fit with my counsel about doing it when a developer looks at me and says, look, you have two different zones that are pretty similar here, and in this zone I can get this density, but in this zone I have more freedom to sort of orient my project the way I want, and it's the same density. I might be able to get a higher yield out of the second zone that I'm asking for, But what I'm asking for is the flexibility to orient my project this way. I only want the density of the other zone. In that circumstance, I've been willing to do a development agreement that says we will change the zone, and it's subject to and conditioned on the approval of a site plan for the project within 90 days that does this. I've been willing to do that when a developer is asking for specifically a different zone and a different kind of entitlement for the purpose of flexibility and maybe setbacks or orientation of buildings or something that the other zone allows. But as a manner of having somebody come before me and say, I want this zone and this is the project I want to build, I have some hesitation on just signing a development agreement to restrict it to the project that, you know, is not proposed by the developer, but the city is saying, we don't want to give you the full entitlement of the zone, but we're willing to change the zone if you'll limit your entitlement to this. That's uncomfortable for me, and I've never liked doing it that way.
I think one of the most important and most overlooked provisions in the development agreement is how to handle changes to the agreement, right? Because a lot of times the development agreement is 10 years, 20 years. We cannot predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen, right, in that amount of time, okay? What's the procedure if everybody agrees that it should go differently? You know, do you have to renegotiate that agreement from scratch? You know, why did you even make it that long in the first place, right? And so we try to have a provision in there about how to make changes. What changes can the staff make? And what changes have to go to council for their approval? That's usually like density, road placement, stuff like that. What changes can the staff make? Well, the staff can make changes, you know, about fenestrations on the front of a building or, you know, any number of things. But I think that's overlooked, and I think that gets ignored, and it's really an important part to go with what you guys are saying.
Any comments or any of your questions about development agreements out there? Yes, question here. Craig? Oh, here. It's the only mic we got. We'll repeat it. It's the only mic we've got right now. Go ahead. So about dissolving a development agreement.
So I want to say this about that. The question is there ever a case when MDA can be dissolved? And you can put terms in your MDA about, you know, like the day that it ends, right? It expires at such and such a day or under such and such circumstances. A bigger concern for me, though, is, and I don't know if this is something you're experiencing, but a situation where a development agreement is part of a zone change. And even in the development agreement, it says, after this date, the zoning reverts back to what it was before we passed this development agreement. And to me, that's not even close to legal. You can't have it automatically revert like that. That's divestment of the police power. You've got to actually have the public hearing and all the legislative things that are necessary in order to change the zoning. So dissolving kind of comes into play in that case. You know, it dissolves. Does it go away to nothing? I don't think so.
The question about the jurisdiction changing for a particular agreement is an interesting one, and I've had that come up in my practice, and thankfully we've negotiated around it as opposed to trying to answer the question. I don't know the answer to that. If a development agreement were reached in a county that actually did land use entitlement and then the property annexed, I don't know how you necessarily, I mean, my assumption has always been that we ought to try and honor the land use entitlement and we ought to negotiate to that point in some way. And that's the way I've always advised my client. I've never had anybody that said, I want to push that, it's annexed, I want to dissolve the agreement. I've never had that happen. So I don't know the answer to that. On Brent's issue about zoning reversions, I have used a zoning reversion before within a remarkably short clock. I've never done it in an agreement. I've done it in the ordinance that rezoned a piece of property. And to the point, I guess, on some of those rezones I talked about earlier where it was conditioned on a particular kind of development, I've put a 90-day clock on the site plan. And if the site plan didn't come in, then we've, you know, I don't build into the process, but I've always advised my client, the zoning reverts, but do not change your zoning map until you have a public hearing and go through the process to put the property back to what the zone was. I just think it's that sort of gray area. The process is really simple to see in the statute. We know what it is. Go through the process.
I think you're
Right.
much safer saying that the zoning doesn't actually become effective until conditions are met, rather than saying the zoning reverts.
We've used that before, but that has affected the financing for engineering.
No, that's a good point.
So.
Charlie?
Out. So to me, it's about whether or not the development agreement and the zone change were interlocked, right? Where the zone change happened, the development agreement was signed as part of that, right? And then having a provision later in the development agreement saying if this expires, it goes back to the original zoning, right? I mean, obviously, you know, the whole thing about diverting yourself with the police power is one council can't lock a subsequent council's hands as to what they have to do. They can't do legislative things that they didn't go through the process to and do that legislatively, right? And so down the road, you're changing the zone from what the development agreement said. You're flipping that back to something else. That's just a zone change to me. It's not really reversion. You had a zoning that was in place. You're changing it to something else. You have to go through the process. No, not at all. I mean, the legislative authority can be, we're going to change this to any zoning we want, you know, without creating a taking, you know.
There is a little known provision in LUDMA. I don't think it's disappeared. I think it's still there. But it's a provision that essentially says once you receive an entitlement on a piece of property, you need to act with some diligence to exercise on it. And if you don't, it's essentially void. I've never tested that. I never want to. I don't want to go through that battle. I have had clients that have had 30-year-old development agreements that are brought in front of a city and said, we want to execute on this now. And you know, they were lines drawn on a map without regard to topography or anything else. Been able to successfully negotiate around those instances. But that's a hard question, and it's not, I don't think it has a truly easy answer. I don't like reversions in zoning. I think that's a hard concept to work around. We've used them very, very sparingly, thankfully. But all of that being sort of addressed in a development agreement is the only way to avoid the big issue. And the other thing I will say is I'm now old enough that I've seen a few 20 and 25-year development agreements out there, and I'll be darned, but not one of them has the exact same condition now that I thought would be there at the time we signed it. Not a single one of them.
All right. Craig, you want to come on up and give
Any
us
housekeeping?
final instructions for tomorrow? And we are at the end of our session, so we don't want to keep you any longer. We really appreciate your participation, your comments and questions. I think this was a good session. Thanks to Todd Godfrey, to Brent Bateman for their participation here and their infinite wisdom and experience. And with that, we will close today's session, and then Craig's going to give us some instructions for tomorrow.
If you're interested in the story that was on KSL News, it's in the conference materials. The printed copy with photos is there. You have a QR code in your printed materials, or it's on the utahlanduse.org conference page. Also, if you're a realtor, be sure to pick up your certificate now. That's the way it has to be done for real estate purposes. Anyway, we do want to challenge you to be sure to be here before the governor shows up tomorrow morning, bright and early at 8:30. Please be rested up and ready to engage in the same kind of back and forth with him that you have with this panel today. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.